up to order for December 1st, 2022. And can we have roll call?
We sure can. Commissioner Arnridge,
Here.
Commissioner Geringer,
Here.
Commissioner Thorpe, Vice Chair Butt, and Chair Nowak.
Here.
Okay, we do have a quorum.
Great, thank you. And we will now move on to public comment. The public's invited to address the committee on any item not listed on the agenda. And you can find all the information on our agenda. Do we have any members of the public here? I don't see any.
We do not.
Okay, no written comments either then, I assume.
No.
Okay, thank you. We will then move on to the consent calendar.
Chair Nowak, would it be
Yes.
okay if we shared the video really quick?
Oh, yeah, sorry about, I forget the video.
We're back. We're not back.
Yeah, I know. City council is back, so I've forgotten all about the start thing. Video, thank you. Sorry, Christina.
That's okay. Whoops, I'm sharing the wrong thing.
That's us.
One of those mornings already. There it is.
Due to COVID-19, this meeting will be conducted as a Zoom meeting pursuant to the provisions of Assembly Bill 361, which suspends certain requirements of the Brown Act. This meeting is being live streamed on the CCTA website. The chair will call upon members, staff, and other speakers by name. Please speak clearly and state your name before giving comments or remarks. Persons participating via Zoom with their cameras enabled are reminded that their activities are visible to viewers. Members participating by Zoom wishing to speak should physically raise their hand and unmute their mic when called upon. Members should mute their mics when done speaking. Citizens participating by Zoom wishing to speak should use the Raise Hand feature or dial *9 if participating via phone, and the chair or staff will call upon them at the appropriate time. Citizens will have 3 minutes to speak. After 3 minutes, staff will lower their hand and mute their mic. Participants via phone will be called upon by the last 4 digits of their phone number. It is requested that public speakers state their names and organization, but providing such information is voluntary. Written public comments received in accordance with the teleconferencing special notice for public comment guidelines are printed on the meeting agenda. If authors of the written correspondence would like to speak, they should raise their hand and the chair will call upon them at the appropriate time. All written correspondence received after that and during the meeting will be entered into the record. A roll call vote will be taken for all action items. Thank you for participating in a meeting of the Contra Costa Transportation Authority.
Okay, thank you. We'll now move on to consent calendar. We have no public comments on the consent calendar, right?
Correct.
Okay. And does anybody want to pull any items from the consent calendar? No? Okay. I will ask for a motion.
Move approval of the consent calendar. Geringer.
Second.
Great. We have a motion and a second. Can we have the roll call vote, please?
Yes. Commissioner Arnridge,
Aye.
Commissioner Geringer,
Aye.
and Chair Nowak.
Yes.
Okay, the motion passes
Okay.
unanimously with the members present.
Yes. Thank you. All right. We'll now move on to the regular agenda items. And first up, we have the legislative update. And I know Mark needs to get off as soon as possible. So we'll have Mark go first. Lindsay, is that all right?
Yeah, I think that was the plan. So Mark, we'll let you provide your update.
Thank you very much. And I hope my voice doesn't freak you out. Got a cold. So thank you for having me here today. I wanted to cover a couple things. First off, I had developed a series of notes to talk about what the governor had intended to do, which was to call a proclamation. And sure enough, yesterday he did issue a proclamation to call the legislature back in special session. The special session would start concurrent with the regular new legislative session on December 5th. And the objective is to enact a windfall tax on the manufacturers of motor vehicle fuels, as well as gives additional powers to state agencies for the ability to review gas costs and prices. So we'll see how that goes. As a reminder, special sessions have their own rules. It will start on December 5th, as I indicated. It'll go until the legislature closes it through a resolution. A proclamation can only cover one item. In this case, it's the oil tax and reporting information. Typically, they rely on the existing relevant committees. For example, in this case, probably revenue tax and appropriations in both houses. So it should be something notable. The legislative leadership said they're not going to call the membership back until January. So even though it starts on December 5th, the activities will not be underway until they come back in January. As a reminder, this is the time of the year for the new legislative session. I alluded to the fact that December 5th is the day established in the Constitution for all members to be sworn in and cast votes for leadership positions. So that's scheduled for this coming Monday. They typically allow the introduction of one or two bills by each person who's sworn in. So we'll see if there's anything that's introduced. Following December 5th, the legislature will then recess until they reconvene on January 4th. And then after that, some relevant key dates are going to be January 10th, when the governor introduces the budget bill. January 20th, which is the last day to submit bill requests to Leg Council, and February 17th, with the deadline to introduce bills. It's been hard to try to pin down the folks who've been elected, because some of the late vote counting hasn't been completed. So we've got a situation where, in many cases, we have new folks elected to their positions. In fact, the assembly will see 18 new members along with their comrades on Monday. Several races are still too close to call. The 47th AD, the council member in Palm Springs, is ahead by 21 points as of this point. And then in the Congress, Mr. Duarte is leading Mr. Gray by 600 points. So we'll see how that goes. The Assembly distinctively had a caucus in the recent weeks where they decided to retain Speaker Rendon as the speaker for a period of time, with a transition to be called for in June after the budget put together. So at that point, it's expected that Assembly Member Robert Rivas, will be named Speaker in June. In the Senate, there are 8 new first-time legislators who will be assuming seats. And there's one seat where the contention has the two contenders separated by 200 votes. That should be clarified over the weekend. We'll see who is the ultimate winner. The last thing I wanted to mention is the state budget. We think, I think I reported earlier that there'd been a $4.5 billion shortfall in terms of revenues for the current year. A little bit below forecast. That put the budget together. Well, in the subsequent month, the legislative analysts had their annual revenue snapshot, and they're showing a revenue decline around $25 billion. The administration officials are looking to see if the revenue decline can be dealt with over several years, which would reduce the impact on current year programs. So that's what I have to report today, and I apologize for my crummy voice today.
No problem. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Any questions for Mark? Okay.
Mark, thanks for being here. What's your inside look at whether or not the legislature is actually going to act and do this special tax?
I think they'll come up with something, but I don't think it'll be a tax. I think there's a huge sensitivity to taxation issues right now. And they don't want to, in spite of the fact that it's pertaining to super large profits. It's in the oil industry and it could have an effect on gas. And I think that's what the industry's push. So I'd be very surprised if they end up with a windfall tax. There's a lot of examination going on about any prior efforts. So they found that Alaska had tried one of these and didn't go very well. And back in 1980, Congress authorized a windfall tax, and it was a mixed result. So I think there's an overly cautious feeling within the legislature about new taxes of this type. So I would guess that they're going to come up with some alternative.
Great. Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking. But I also noted the day after the November election, it was interesting. California gas prices dropped 45 to 50 cents a gallon throughout the entire state. That was pretty cool. So,
Mhm.
Mark, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Mark. Lindsay, we're moving on to Gus.
Yeah, if there are no more questions from anyone from Mark, then we'll move on to our federal update. We've got Gus Maples here with Ty Ginsburg and Associates to share an update with us. Morning, Gus.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I wanted to start out with a quick recap of the congressional midterm election since we last spoke. A little bit to be expected with the redistricting, but of course, everyone knows Congressman Garamendi has, through California's redistricting process, picked up a little bit of the county and will be a new member of our Contra Costa delegation. Positive news is he currently sits on the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, along with Congressman DeSaulnier, who has maintained his bulk of the Contra Costa County in his district as well. Of course, Congressman McNerney was retiring this cycle and did not run for re-election. But those are two, transportation focused members, and we've had good meetings with some of the staff that came to DC earlier this summer with both of those as well. Larger dynamics, the House is of course flipping to Republican control in the upcoming year. One thing that had kind of been up in the air with that change and more of a focus on fiscal austerity was going to be the status of congressionally directed spending or earmarks. Now we've heard that the House Republican Conference did vote yesterday afternoon to maintain that process. That's positive news for those line item budget line items through the appropriations bills. Of course, that helped fund the $1.2 million smart signals upgrade in Concord that CCTA successfully secured last fiscal year. That was one thing that was really up in the air with the change in control, and it seems to be staying in place now. A little bit shorter term, the appropriations for fiscal year 23. Of course, government funding runs out, currently scheduled for December the 16th. I was just actually meeting with some of the Senate appropriations staff earlier this morning, and they are passing back and forth offers with the Democrats yesterday, overnight, continuing to negotiate on a top line funding level. And then once that is agreed to, each of the 12 individual subcommittees, including Transportation and HUD, will get their allocations to hammer out the remaining details, the differences in the House and Senate's bills. And that sets funding levels for programs like RAISE grants, a lot of the discretionary programs that were created but maybe not fully funded through the historic bipartisan infrastructure law. That could slip, just given the amount of time left and what remains to do. That could slip a few days into the following week. There is about 5 or so work days before the Christmas holidays begin from the current deadline. But obviously, a logjam seemed to break yesterday, so fingers crossed on some forward progress here. Also on the congressional agenda is the national defense policy legislation that has to pass annually, and the Electoral Count Reform Act as a way to clarify the election certification process following the 2020 presidential election. So a lot still on the agenda. Some of those bills could be rolled into probably a year-end omnibus. But we'll keep an eye over the next few days as these things develop. And one other note, I've shared this with Lindsay, and I'm sure the team will be reviewing, but the RAISE grants, extremely popular with local governments as well as eligible for these, was just announced for a new round of funding at $1.5 billion today. So that process is now live, accepting applications through the end of February.
Okay, thanks, Gus. Any questions of Gus? No? Okay. Thanks very much, Gus. Appreciate it. We
Actually,
will.
Sue,
Teresa has a question.
Oh.
sorry, no, just a comment,
Sorry, I
but
didn't.
no, because I paused. I decided to step in after you were moving. Anyway, I just wanted to thank Gus for keeping us up to date on this, but also for delivering very good news on this beautiful rainy morning that the earmarks will continue through. So appreciate all of the work that you and the team do. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, we will move on to the next item, which is approval of proposed Measure J reserve policy.
Good morning, Madam Chair. My name is Hisham Naimi. I'm the Director of Programming. I do have a PowerPoint presentation that I'm gonna try to go through quickly for this item. Let me share my screen so you can see my screen.
Yeah, can you make it, yep, great.
Great, thank you. I think the presentation will be a good context for the policy discussion. The points I want to make in these presentations are the following. One, we still have 12 more years to go on Measure J, and a lot could happen in that period in terms of what would impact our revenues. The second point, although we try to be conservative, our long-range forecast in the past has fluctuated by about 10% after the Great Recession 2008. That's about $274 million from, if you look at the low and the high. And because we issued bond, we pretty much are done with most of the capital projects in Measure J. And 93% of what we programmed in Measure J for capital project has already been spent. Because of that, the way we dealt with revenue reductions in the past, when they happen, was to basically cap the funding on the capital projects. That is no longer feasible because we're done with the projects. There is not much to cap. Especially if the reductions we're talking about are more than 1 to 2%. The reserve policy gives us a tool that we really need to ensure that the percentages that go to the programs in Measure J are not impacted by future revenue shortfalls if we end up with dealing with some. So with that, I'll be quick in my presentation. I know a lot of you already know this, but I thought it'll be a good context for the policy discussion. So Measure J, as you know, was adopted in 2004 and started in 2009, and we're just past the half point in the measure. It expires in 2034. The sub-regional equity in Measure J was an important factors. And each sub-region basically, I'm sorry, I'm Did I skip a slide? Okay, here we go. The expenditure plan guides how we spend our Measure J dollars. It assigns funding to specific projects and programs. And as you can see in this pie chart, 57% of the funding goes to the programs on an annual basis, like bus operations and road maintenance, while the remaining 43% goes to fund capital projects. That 43% also pays for our debt service on issued bonds, as well as program management cost. The expenditure plan was developed on the assumption that we will collect $2 billion in 2004 dollars over the 25 years of Measure J. It did not set priority in which projects to complete first, and it did not include a contingency in case our revenues fall short of the assumed $2 billion. And as I mentioned, subregional equity was an important factor in developing Measure J expenditure plan. The 4 subregions in the county are somewhat different and have different needs. And each subregion decided how much of their share in Measure J to put into the capital projects versus the programs. In East County, the majority of their share went into projects, while in West County, the majority went into programs. That's how the subregions wanted their share split. The Great Recession of the 2008 had a profound impact on our Measure J revenue. It basically cut our revenue forecast by 30%, which is significant. And instead of the $2 billion, the forecast is 1.6 billion. In escalated dollars, we're talking about a reduction of about 1.1 billion. So instead of 3.7 billion that we were projecting at the beginning of the measure, the latest forecast shows we will likely only have 2.6 billion. And this slide shows how our revenue forecast fluctuated. In the past, you can see them in both 2004 dollars as well as in escalated dollars. Following the 2008 recession, the forecast basically ranged between 2.4 billion to 2.7 billion in escalated dollars. That's a range of about 274 million, or about 10% of our current projections. The good news, as you can see in the last 2 lines, the last 2 strategic plan, the forecast held steady at about 2.6 billion despite COVID-19. This chart graphically shows our forecast. The dark blue line was our revenue in the 2019 strategic plan, while the pale blue line is the latest revenue forecast, which we adopted part of the 22 strategic plan. As you can see from the slope of the lines, we are being more conservative moving forward compared to the prior strategic plan. It's always easier to deal with excess revenues than the opposite. And you may ask, well, how did we cope with the 30% reduction in our revenue projection since there was no contingency in the expenditure plan? The authority basically imposed expenditure caps on all Measure J capital projects. On average, each project category received only 67% of what there was shown in the expenditure plan. That basically allowed us to ensure that the Measure J funding commitments are reduced to match the reductions in revenues. To keep these projects funded, we had to compete basically for state and federal money to make up the difference. As you recall, the Caldecott Tunnel Fourth Bore was awarded the second largest award from the federal stimulus funds in 2009. And that's how we kept that projects moving. The same is true with most of the other projects. On the program side, the reduction in revenue basically was reflected in the annual allocation each program receives, since they just get a percentage of what the final actual revenue number is. Despite the impact of the Great Recession, we were able to keep our promise to the voters by basically the 4-pronged approach you see in the slide. we basically accelerated the delivery of our projects during the Great Recession when things were relatively cheap and interest rates low. At this time, most of the capital projects in Measure J are delivered or under construction. Out of the $750 million in Measure J funds programmed for capital projects in the strategic plan, $700 million is already spent. That leaves about $50 million for the remaining 12 years. And if you look at both Measure C and Measure J, we spent a total of $1.4 billion to date on capital projects, and that attracted 3 times that amount from other fund sources for a total investment of $5.6 billion. And these some of the projects that we completed. I'm just gonna go quickly through them. And these are some of the estimated benefits from completing these projects in terms of travel time savings for select origin destinations. And that travel time savings basically translate to about $60 million in annual savings. That doesn't take into account safety improvements and other improvements as well. And this slide shows the specific project categories in Measure J. Only a few projects left to be done. Most of the remaining projects do have a significant funding shortfall, and that's why we continue to compete for state and federal money to get them fully funded. We just submitted 2 applications to the CTC to secure funding for Phase 2 of the I-80 San Pablo Dam Road interchange, as well as the I-680 CARM. You probably know about the $396 million grant we submitted for MEGA. That will help us fund 684 as well as Innovate 680. Measure J is not about state highways only. Only a small portion goes to state highways. In fact, as you can see from the slide, about 70% of Measure J goes to help the cities and county as well as transit agencies. And these are the programs that are funded by Measure J. By the end of the measure, we anticipate about $1.4 billion out of the total $2.6 billion will be invested in these programs. Funding from these programs help our jurisdictions and agencies deliver services to our residents. On average, Measure J makes about 9% of transit agencies' budgets in Contra Costa. In fiscal year 20 alone, $11.8 million was allocated to transit programs. And some of the services in Contra Costa would not exist without Measure J, such as the ferry service in Richmond and the La Morinda and traffic school bus programs. The TLC and the ped bike programs are unique since the projects are selected on a competitive basis. Over the life of the measure, we anticipate to spend about $142 million for these 2 programs. To date, we programmed about $54 million for 85 projects, and 60 of those 85 projects are now complete. And these are the list of the projects in each sub-regions. I'm going to go through them. And now let's switch gears and talk about reserve policy. Why do we need a reserve? As you saw from the previous slides, we have pretty much spent 93% of Measure J funds programmed for capital projects. If our revenues fall short of our projections for whatever reason, like COVID or another Great Recession, we no longer have the ability to further cap Measure J funding on capital projects because that money is already spent. So we might find ourselves in a situation where we need to reduce the percentages going to the various programs to allow us to deal with the debt service payments that we have annually, which is about $40 million. That is not something anyone wants to do. As you saw from the slides, our jurisdictions depend on that money. Because of that, we, in order to be well prepared for the next great recession, we need another tool. The reserve policy will be that tool should our projections fall short. We can use the reserve funds basically to reduce the impacts on the programs and address emergencies. Any funding in the reserve funds will need to be spent only on uses that are eligible under the Measure J expenditure plan. This slide lists those eligible uses, including funding priority Measure J projects and programs and addressing emergencies as identified by the board. The reserve is proposed to be funded over time by revenue windfalls when the actual revenue is higher than what we assumed during the mid-year budget process. The difference between the two will go into the reserve. For example, in the last fiscal year 22, we budgeted $108 million. And the actual revenues came in at $120 million. If we had this policy in place, we would have put that difference of $12 million into the reserve. We looked back. Looks like I missed a slide. Anyway, we looked back at the last 13 years since the measure started. The difference between the budget and the budgeted amount and the actual amount basically ranged between minus $1 million to plus $5 million. If you take the last 2 years out, which were unusual because of COVID and the money pumped in the economy. So again, if our actual revenues come in below what we assumed in the budget, then no money will go into the reserve for that year. And in terms of appropriation of funds, as per the process to utilize the funds from the reserve, the policy requires that the board takes an action to appropriate the funds by adopting a resolution specifying the amount and the uses. Staff will also report on the status of the reserve in the annual budget. With that, I'll end my presentation. We are seeking your approval of Resolution 2233P. Be happy to answer any questions.
I'm going to get out of mute there. I had a couple of questions. So historically, while we've had several years that obviously our revenues have exceeded expectations, we've just used that in different projects through the budget process. We haven't ever, set up a reserve historically.
We actually, during Measure C, we had adopted a policy to establish a reserve, but we only put the remaining Measure C amount into that reserve, which was about $300,000. So it's not really going to make much difference, the $300,000. So that's why we need to increase that amount to address large reductions in our revenues in the future if they happen.
Yeah, but just sorry, can I chime in real quick, Sue? Because
sure.
Part of your question is, what do we do? So, for example, in this last fiscal year, what did we do with that $12 million?
With the 12 million, yeah.
The 12 million, right? And so what we do is we do a true-up payment, basically, with all of the programs. So for example, with transit operators, what we would typically do is we would budget, we would do based on the percentages in the expenditure plan. We would essentially distribute the funds based on the $108 million. And then we wait for the actuals. And then if the actuals exceed the projected, then what we do is we take the 12 million and based on the percentages in the expenditure plan, distribute that to the rest of the program. So accessible transportation, transit operators, ferry service. And so that 12 million just gets distributed like it would normally based on the expenditure plan.
Okay, to the programs, not to the projects, obviously, but the programs.
That's right. And to the projects, that money basically does not get programmed until we update the strategic plan in the next cycle. So when we do the update to the strategic plan, we will update our revenue projection based on these actuals. And if there is any excess revenues, then it gets programmed to the capital projects.
So, I guess the other question is sort of, setting a reserve policy now as we, potentially are heading into a recession. Are we a little late in setting that up in order to prevent that in the next year or two? And does this, does it make more sense? I mean, it certainly, can start now, but, we're kind of late for the potential recession we're heading into now versus setting a reserve to help us somewhere down the line.
I don't think we're late. I think it's good to have this policy, and we will see where the actual revenues come in. We have been conservative in our projections, long range projections, anticipating something will happen in the future. So the best case scenario that our actual revenues for next year come in still higher than what we were projecting in the budget or in the strategic plan. It would have been great if we'd done it when Measure J started, but at that time we had a plan because the project's money has not yet been spent. So we would have, at that point, we had a tool to basically to cope with large reductions in revenues.
And so how do you decide how much of the reserve to use to the extent, let's say you build up a reserve in 3 or 4 years and you have a downturn? How do we decide at that point how much of the reserve to use versus not use and keep the powder dry for future potential issues?
Yeah, it's going to depend. I mean, that's going to be a board decision at that point to see how bad the programs are suffering. For example, if there are emergencies, then at least you have that ability to make that decision versus now where it will be what it is.
Mm-hmm.
But it'll be nice to have that ability. And that's what we're trying to do with reserve policies, to give you a tool to make a decision whether to smooth the valleys and the peaks to make sure the impacts to the programs are not significant.
Yeah, and maybe just to chime in again. So our goal is to report out what's going to be in this reserve on an annual basis as part of when Brian does his annual budget overview to the board and seek approval of the annual budget, we'll report out what the reserves would be in that particular year. And then it would be really at the board's discretion at that time to direct staff on, I think we have enough money in the reserve and we want to reallocate based on the expenditure plan or whatever the board would like to do, based on the eligible uses that Hisham laid out in his presentation. So there'll be some updates back to the board and then some discussion about when we want to use or not use the reserves.
Okay. Noel?
Yeah, those are great questions, by the way. One, I think this is a really good idea, and actually it's timely because we're likely to see, at least here in Contra Costa County, based on the estimates I'm getting from same agency that we use for ours, but we use it for our city, that we will have some excess revenues. So now is a good time. Yeah, it would have been great to have it then, but we also, when you go forward, we reset our revenue expectations relative to what we think the economy. Our goal is to make it as close as possible, but you have hiccups either way. So we use this on another agency that I sit on. We've had it in place for 35, 40 years, and it works really effective. There is never, that I've seen in any other agency, a predetermined way that you use the reserve fund, because in fact you couldn't. You don't know what the circumstances are. You don't know how. So it's a smoothing effect that you can say, well, the estimates are, it looks like it's going to last 3 years. And so you start to do it that way, but we never defease all of those funds out of there. So I think it's a good idea. The question is, if we looked backwards, and I'm guessing, and I don't know, Hisham, if you know this, had we put this in place when we started in 2004, we might likely be just about dead even at this point. Shortfall, upfall in real dollars.
Thank you, Commissioner. That's a good question. In the staff report, there is actually a table that shows the actual versus the mid-year budget amount. And
overall, what was that? I was just trying to look it up, and I can't get in.
No problem. It was actually a positive $41 million.
Yeah, I was about to say
Oh, was
40
that?
million.
Yeah,
But
that, the last
that
2
didn't
years were
account for, yeah, but that didn't account for the fact that we were keeping $30 to $60 million in cash reserves because we had that, I won't use the adjective, but we had a financial instrument that forced us to put it away. So we had to do that. We had to create a cash reserve policy without having a reserve policy because we had a contract that mandated it. So not a fair comparison in that sense. But I do think this is appropriate now to do it. And we just put it in our investment account of the overages. And let's be honest, we all like to get extra money. When you have a budget and we tell the other agencies where they're getting, that's what they budget and they act. And when we write them a check for an extra amount of money, you know exactly what happens. It just goes into the system. We didn't get a higher level of service. We didn't get all those things. So I think this is a better tool to manage because this is a cash flow funding source versus a capital where you're buying an object. We're just helping things run. So I think this is timely to do this. I think it's a great idea. And
My concern only on timing is, let's say, we get through a recession next year, maybe a shallow one, and we start building up the reserve at some point. I think every year when we take a look at it, we say, do we need to, put that back into the system rather than continuing to build a reserve? At some point, you need to put it back into programs, not just when a downturn occurs, because you might be accumulating more money that you really ought to be returning to the taxpayers in some form or fashion. And I think that's just going to be important when we look at it every year, when we look at the reserve policy.
Right, but there's another thing this goes for too, is our agency doesn't necessarily just end date specific. The revenue, the forward revenue does, but having reserve money keeps the agency around so it can finish any projects it has. And as you've seen, we leverage, are very good at getting matching funds and things like that. If we get some of these other funds, we'll probably run another 10 years. So that also goes in place, and you can leverage those banked monies against revenues in the future. So it's also a tool to keep us going. And clearly we're going to make an attempt to show the value proposition of why to extend or do another tax measure. But I think this is a healthy management tool for the longevity and the success of our agency.
Teresa, Lamar, Teresa?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for the great questions. And I agree that, Sue, as part of our evaluation each year, that we do look at that we're not just building this big reserve. Newell, I appreciate the point that you just made, though, that that reserve can help us also continue for the viability of the organization. So I'm very much in support of this. I think a couple of years ago when we were having these discussions, or maybe as short as a year ago, having a reserve policy came up in discussions that we all questioned. And so I think the time to have it, it's a good time to put it in place now. So thank you.
Okay, any other questions from people? Okay, I will ask for public comment on this. Is there anybody from the public that wishes to speak? Or Christina, did we get any written public comment on this item?
No written public comment, and I see no hands raised.
Okay, great. Then I will bring it back for a motion.
I would move the item as presented here and recommend this go to the full board.
Second.
Karen. Okay, go ahead, Lamar.
Okay, we have a motion from Armrich, a second from Thorpe. Can we have the roll call vote, please?
Yes, Commissioner Arnrich,
Aye.
Commissioner Geringer,
Aye.
Commissioner Thorpe, thank you, and Chair Noack.
Yes.
Excellent.
Okay. Motion passes. Thank you. We'll move on to item 5, correspondence and communications. I don't think we have any. Does anybody? Okay. Commissioner and staff comments. I have no comments myself. Any other commissioners have comments? Executive staff, Tim? No?
No,
All right.
sorry, had to find the mute button. No comment.
I saw the head shaking, so I assumed that was what that meant. All right, I don't think we have any other business, so we will move to closed session. And I think Christina's going to give us a breakout room.
Yes, I'm going to pause. our
We need to make a
recordings.
announcement of what the meeting is and then go into that, don't we?
Okay.
We have a closed session on public employee performance evaluation for the executive director. Excuse me.
And Christina, do I just need to click join to get in?
Yes,
Okay.
well, I'm hoping so. This is my,
Because I got an invitation at the beginning of the meeting to join and
Yeah.
I